All right. Welcome to the Grind Hill Chronicles podcast. I'm your host, Don Bishop. I write fantasy as T.S. Pedramon. And here we are today with author Laura Nelson. And Laura, we had a conversation last week, which will come out in the future. So listeners, as you listen to this episode, today as we record, it is December 12th, 2023. And Merry Christmas, by the way, because I'm planning for this episode to come out on Christmas Day. So Merry Christmas to everybody out there in internet land. And our conversation from last week was more about the author journey. We never really got around to the topic that we intended. So we bring you that topic today. And last week's episode will release in January. I'm looking at probably... Sorry, I'm looking for what date I pushed it to, and I'm not seeing that right now. It actually, that conversation might come out in February. Anyway, we'll figure that out. If you want to hear more from author Laura Nelson, then check us again in the new year, and you'll hear us have another conversation that we had last week. For now, so Laura, you write some historical fantasy, and you write Norse fantasy. And I think there are a lot of ways, and I'm looking at the notes from the email here. I think there are a lot of ways that could go. So why don't you tell us what these two things are, what they encompass? So historical fantasy, I mean, maybe like Pride and Prejudice and zombies, although that would be more like no, that's not historical. That'd be Regency horror.
Yeah. So historical fantasy, it's a subgenre of historical fiction, which in of itself is like a literary genre. And generally speaking, with historical fiction, you're dealing with actual like things that happened. So I'm trying to think. Technically, Pride and Prejudice nowadays would be considered historical, like kind of historical, but at that time it would have been like contemporary.
Yeah, like you mean like historical fiction then, because it takes place in a historical era.
Yeah. So for Jane Austen writing Pride and Prejudice, it was contemporary for her, but it's historical for us. Actually, a really good example of a famous piece of historical fiction is A Knight in King Arthur's Court, or A Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, because and that's actually a time travel kind of story.
Yeah, it is.
But that is, I want to say, A Yankee in King Arthur's Court is considered to be what?
A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court.
Connecticut Yankee, yes, is considered to be one of the first actually published pieces of historical fiction that we know of. And so, at least that is categorized as historical fiction, because you have the main character who gets tossed back into the past, into King Arthur's court, into medieval England. So yeah, that's the fun fact about historical fiction.
I would point out, in case this story pops in anybody else's mind, that's different from Don Quixote, or Don Quixote. Don Quixote was contemporary, but the main character wished he were back in historic times, and even wished he were in historic fantasy times, because he tried to fight a giant,
Yeah. So Don Quixote would be different. Would be different just because it took place in the author's contemporary period.
Yeah.
As opposed to a past time. I'm trying to think of other famous, Outlander, for people who like their time travel romances, Outlander is considered historical fiction.
Mm. Yeah. Well, why don't
Yeah.
we go ahead and toss yours in the mix? Because you have a book. Is tomorrow's book historical fantasy?
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
you have a book coming out tomorrow on December 26th.
Correct.
Tomorrow, as
Yes.
this episode is released.
Yep. So Priestess of Herculaneum is also a historical fantasy. The main character is a museum archivist in Washington, D.C., and she goes to an art exhibit at a unnamed museum on the mall. But you can kind of, if you are familiar with the museums in downtown DC, you will see where I get my inspiration from. But she goes to an art exhibit, and while she's there, she ends up being tossed into the past, into Herculaneum, which is a town near Pompeii, in the year 79 AD, right before Vesuvius is to erupt. And when she arrives there, at first she's like, this can't be real. This is all in my head. But it's not. It's not in her head. It's completely real. As are all of the mythology, all the gods and goddesses of Greek and Roman. They're all real. They're just not the way that the stories talked about them. And so the main character, Alex, is now in Herculaneum, and she's visited by the muse of history, Cleo, who tells her that she is here to save someone. And in order to get back home, she needs to save this guy. And that is the story. I won't give away too many spoilers. People can read it tomorrow. But that's kind of the premise, is that she got tossed back into the past. She has to save the day, or at least one person's day, and then hopefully get home.
Okay. So how do you approach world building for that? And I know you mentioned, World Anvil, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how
So
do you approach it?
So with historical fantasy, I do have to kind of base things in a little bit of reality, because this history has existed. Like, people know about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. They know about, stuff about ancient Roman culture, that kind of stuff. However, especially with ancient history, there's a lot that we can speculate about, but we don't actually have records of. And so both with that, and then also the concept of time travel, that is sometimes people will say time travel is science fiction. Some people say it's fantasy. Some say it's both. I'm kind of in the both category.
Depends how it is accomplished.
Exactly.
And science fiction is a subset of fantasy anyway. I know those are fighting words, but that's my stance. The difference is aesthetic.
Yeah. So, generally speaking, if time travel is created through some form of magic, so like in Outlander, she touches the stones and she gets tossed back into the past. In my story, it is the muse Cleo who tosses her back into the past. That would fall more into the fantasy realm, whereas time travel, like I am now blanking on the name of the movie. Back to the Future. Back to the Future. They time travel because of a plutonium fueled car, which is absolutely science fiction. I have a theory that Back to the Future is actually historical fiction as well, because not only does it start in 1985, and then even when they go to the future, it's 2015, which is the past now. But then they also go back to, I want to say, 1885 in one of the movies. So yes, Back to the Future, the whole series is historical fiction. As uncomfortable as that might make some people.
I would say Back to the Future 2 would be, you can't, the time period
Well, that
is
was to
historical now,
1955.
but when it was created, it was in the future. The 2015 was in the future.
Yeah,
So I would say that
but the two.
you don't have future historical fantasy as a genre. But anyway, sorry, go on.
Well, yeah. Like I said, I will debate that Back to the Future is historical science fiction. And so, but that's the point is that in Back to the Future they use a car, they use technology to move back and forth through time. Whereas in stories like Outlander or even my story, it's more of magic based travel. And
Something's
so
itching, and this is off topic, but there's something itching my mind that there's a story of somebody who had a watch that let them time travel. Do you know? I'm not
that
remembering
sounds
what
familiar.
it was.
Is
Anyway,
it the
okay.
I feel like it was an H.G. Wells story.
I mean, H.G. Wells did write what did he call it? Time Traveler. He wrote that story, but it's
Yeah.
a device. It's a machine that he sits in, so that's not a watch.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm thinking of Clock Stoppers, where it slows down time. That's a movie
Yeah.
directed by Jonathan Frakes, but yeah,
Okay.
kind of a fun movie. Not time travel, just time
Another
dilation.
another good reference for like different ways that time travel is done, and it's kind of scientific, like the science fiction aspect of it, is the TV show Timeless, because they use once again.
haven't seen it.
I would highly recommend it. It's a good show. But they use, I want to say, machines. I don't know if it's necessarily like airplanes or not airplanes, but like flying. It's not a rocket ship. I need to go and rewatch the show, but
It's a
it's not like a
DeLorean.
car or it's not a
Oh,
DeLorean,
not a
no.
car.
But yeah, Timeless is another good example of how time travel can be shown in sort of a science fiction element. But yeah, I like the fantasy element because I like being able to kind of play around a little bit more with how the time travel works. That it could be more magical as opposed to plutonium.
What's tomorrow's book called again?
Priestess of Herculaneum.
Okay. And so the main character, is she from our time and she gets thrown back?
Yes. Yeah, so the story starts in 2009. And she is Washington D.C. every day's, it's a normal day.
Oh, that's right. You said a museum.
Yep. And so then yeah, it starts in March of 2009. So when she gets tossed back in time, she then goes to end of July in 79. So she goes from wearing being in the winter to being in the heat of the summer. And so there's a funny scene about her having to adjust to that and being like, why is it so hot here? Because you got tossed
and it would
back.
be really, yeah. And it's worse if you're not, like, you can be there in the middle of July and you're like, man, it's hot. But if you weren't acclimated to it, it'd be even worse. Like,
and that's actually something that I had to build in my world building into, is figuring out what the temperatures, what the climate, all that kind of stuff would have been compared, like Washington, D.C. in March versus the Gulf of Naples in July, August time period. And how would someone adapt to that? Even though we do have we have buildings and we can see how stuff was laid out, there's a lot of stuff in that we don't have records about, of like daily life. So we can assume the kind of clothing that people wore, how they kept themselves cool, because when I was researching it, Herculaneum, Pompeii, that whole area during the summer is actually very similar. It's a Mediterranean climate, very similar to Southern California. Which means in the summer, even if you have like coastal breezes, even if you have cool air coming off of the water, it's still going to be a very hot place. And so I would have to do not only a little bit of like historical research. What?
Oh, sorry. I think we have some kind of delay. What kind of temperatures are we talking about?
So I want to say the average temperature in like the Gulf of Naples, like during the summer, is in the high 90s.
Okay.
Fahrenheit. So, and they'll sometimes, depending on the day, will hit even triple digits. And so I would say, like, if you've ever been to the coast of California, Southern California, in the middle of the summer, not the desert area, but more of the coastal side, that's probably that's the easiest equivalent I can make. Or if you've been to the American South, where it's super humid, because that's the other thing is that because places like Herculaneum and Pompeii were very close to the Gulf, the Bay of Naples, then it'd be very humid.
Yeah. And I've spent several years in San Diego, in the San Diego area. And now I'm an hour south of DC. Give or take, whatever. But it's definitely a lot more humid here. And I believe it gets hotter here. It definitely gets hotter sooner and stays hotter longer.
Yeah.
Because in San Diego, you have those Pacific waters coming down from Alaska that keep it from getting too hot.
Yeah.
And I don't know.
The Pacific in general, I want to say, is cooler longer than the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So you have to adjust for that kind of stuff in world building. Like, how are people living in these places without air conditioning, without things to keep them from sweating to death or dealing with the humidity? And while we can guess how people might have done that, we don't actually have a lot of records as to how people kept from being all sweaty and stinky and all that kind of stuff during the time. And so that's where some world building comes in, is basically to kind of patch in where we don't have specific information as to how people would have lived.
Pardon me, just finishing my chamomile.
Another element of world building, because this is fantasy and I'm using a background of the gods and goddesses, the muses, those all being real individuals, I have to basically create sort of the background of what causes them to be these supernatural entities. Now, I don't treat them as though they are actual gods and goddesses in my series. Rather, I have that they are immortals, and so they are humans who have the ability to not age past a certain point. And so then I have to do research and world building as to how would that work? How does that work on a biological level? How does that work on a mental, emotional level when you're living in a place and you hit a certain age and everyone else keeps getting older, but you don't? How do you adapt to that? And so
I think it depends on the personality. Some people would I mean, did you see the movie Jumper?
Yeah.
Some people would just be all about number one and like that, and some people would be like, well, I'm set, I'm taken care of. Who else can I take care of?
Yeah. And I do play, and that's once again, this is so world building isn't just about like geography and culture and that kind of stuff, but it's also about building like an inner world for the characters. How are they going to react to the rest of the world? How are you going to have cultures that know about, say you have people who know about immortality. There's going to be little subcultures that grow up within the bigger culture. What is their world building? What is their world like? So
Yeah.
there's even though there's a lot of historical fantasy which involves research of real subjects, of real things that have happened in the past. There's also a lot of world building because you're bringing in that fantastical element of, say, time travel, immortals, these fantastical myths that we've heard of, but we're like, oh, those are just myths from the past. That didn't happen. That wasn't real. What if they were? How does that all fit? How does the fantastical fit in with what we in our world know as real?
So do you grab an element of folklore and then pull the thread and see where it leads you?
Yeah, a lot of times I do. Yeah. I will read a story where I'm just like, oh, this sounds really cool. And I'll be reading about it. It's like, oh, well, this people, scientists and archaeologists and scholars believe that this person was a mythic person and they didn't really exist and they're just an amalgamation of real people, da 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 da. I'm like, what if they were? What if they were a real person? Or even like with different deities from different cultures. What if these were real individuals? And how are they interacting with other deities from other cultures? So I've had people ask me whether or not there's any Norse gods and goddesses in my historical fantasy. I'm like, they technically exist. Thor exists within the historical fantasy world, even if he isn't mentioned in the books. He exists. So it's like, what happens if, Thor goes to meet Mars, goes to meet, Ares? How are these characters going to react to each other?
Have you gotten into Orson Scott Card's Danny North saga, the Gatefather?
I have not.
Series.
Mm-mm.
The okay, let me be careful not to spoil anything. It's pretty good. I listened to the audiobooks, but the premise there, and it's set in modern times. But the premise is that you have all these mythologies from ancient history, and well, they're real, except that the names that have been passed down for these different deities are titles, and and they're not immortal either. So like the in the North family who immigrated from Northern Europe, the North family, it's kind of they live on a compound, kind of a compound for their family, and they're all mages basically, and the most powerful fire mage in the North family is Thor.
Okay.
Like the title, he received
the title
is
of Thor.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And Loki the trickster, he was a gate mage, and that's the title for the And so you have like
for the most powerful
Ares
gate mage.
Ares was the gate mage from the it's not the Greeks. It's who the Greeks actually took their deities from. I don't remember.
Not Macedonia. But yeah, Mycenaean?
Maybe Macedonian.
Mycenaean?
But anyway, so that's kind of the gist of it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a cool concept.
Yeah, I'll have to check out that series.
Here I am
but
accidentally representing for other authors of my faith.
Well, Yeah, they.
Shall we throw
I,
out Brandon Sanderson?
I have no problem with that. Because I'm LDS as well, and so
Yeah.
I like, I've read some of Orson Scott Card's stuff. I've read some of Brandon Sanderson's stuff. And I will say this, actually growing up, I grew up reading a lot of LDS fantasy literature, and a lot of that has inspired me. So, not to get into the author's journey again, but a lot of their world building has inspired my own world building, world building, and how I'm kind of imagining, oh, what if it was like this? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll have to check that series out.
Yeah, it's good.
But yeah, there's a lot of world building that I've had to do with, like I said, with the historical fantasy, piecing together stuff that like, or patching, putting in possible explanations with stuff that we don't know about the cultures, or stuff that, if this mythic story happened, what was it really like? That kind of stuff.
So, forgive me if I have kind of a reductionist tendency, but to put it in a nutshell, to reduce it, if you will. So when you do you do Norse fantasy and you do historical fantasy, would it be accurate, or would you say that your kind of angle is to write stories involving ancient folklore, magic, or deities? Is that where the sources that you draw on for your stories?
A little bit. So the Norse fantasy is more pure. I don't want to say pure fantasy, but it is more like epic fantasy. You're not going to find the Norse gods in my Norse fantasy world. It is a completely different world that is separate from ours. And the only way that you can connect the two is through dragon magic, which our world doesn't really know about or acknowledge.
But you got to have dragons.
You gotta have dragons. So my Norse fantasy has lots of dragons. They are considered to be very powerful deity-like creatures. But they do not. When they do come to our world in my Norse fantasy series, they don't look like dragons. They're just kind of non-corporeal. They don't have bodies. They're more. I don't want to say spirits, but they're mistaken for wind and clouds and that kind of stuff. And so unless you have a connection to the world of Loishara, you would just think that it's a big storm when they're swarming around. And they also are less sentient in our world than they are in their world. But I don't know if you're curious about that. That's another bit of world building. That's more in my Norse fantasy. But yeah, I would say that I do try to take some inspiration from the myths and the lore that we have in our world, and kind of I like to do what ifs. What if the lore, what if the mythology, what if these stories were actually like this, like something else? So
do you ever throw the different cultures' lore in a blender?
A little bit.
And I would say,
in what way? I'm curious.
Well, in Orson Scott Card's Gatefather series, it's not quite like that. It's more like he homogenized the magic, but then spread it out across cultures. So like each family has a fire mage or a gate mage or a whatever, and it's the same. There are only so many different types of mages, and over here they call him Thor. Over here they call him Hephaestus or whatever.
Hephaestus, okay, yeah.
And sure, there's a different culture among
magic,
the Norse
but
people.
it's different names.
Yes. So there's that. Or you can say, like, here's this story that Loki turned into a horse with 6 legs, so that's something Loki can do. There's no such thing
Yeah.
as that in Greek folklore, although Zeus turned himself into a bird and I don't know.
Yeah. So what I do like to do is I'll research and sometimes find more of the obscure stories that aren't so commonly known and be like, how would, you know, how are these similar? And so so if you have a character, so with my historical fantasy, um, you have Apollo who has a lot of connections to healing and the arts and daylight and all that kind of stuff. And you have similar deities in Roman mythology. And so while I say that they are not the same, so Zeus and Jupiter are not the same individual. Apollo
Okay.
is not the same um as, the solar gods in Roman mythology, or even um I want to say, so one of the characters I have is Janus, who
What
is,
about Hercules and Heracles?
so with some of the I will say with some of the characters, they are the same individual. So Poseidon and Neptune are the same
Uh-huh.
person. They just have different names in different cultures because that the culture was like, "Oh, you. That's what we're
Yeah.
going to call you." But so like with Poseidon and Neptune in in my world, his actual name is something completely different. But the Greeks were like, "We're going to call you Poseidon." And he's like, "All right, I'll run with that." And then the Romans are like, "We're going to call you Neptune." He's like, "Okay, I'm going to run with that."
Uh-huh.
Because he's not natively from Greece or Italy. He's from a different place entirely. And so you will have some people like Hercules who, is part of the lore in my historical fantasy where, it's the same person, especially if they've been if there's stories, especially of them traveling between place and place, they're going to be known by different names or similar names. But you're also going to have individuals who have the same powers, and they are more uh, local. So, like
Uh-huh.
Jupiter, he's like, my turf is Italy. This is where my power is, and where people believe in me, and where, this is my turf. And he's not going to go over to Greece and be like, now I'm going to start playing playing in Greece and trying to be all tough over there. He's like, I've got my place. And then Zeus has his turf in Greece. And
Mhm.
so sometimes they'll blend, but then you also have immortals who are just like, this is my turf, this is my area, and no one messes with it. So just like
So
people.
in Priestess of Herculaneum, what would
Hmm.
what is there any other author's work that you would say that it's kind of like that or influenced by that that the listeners might be familiar with?
So I like to say that Priestess of Herculaneum is a blend of Outlander, Doctor Who, and Percy Jackson. I'm also, in some ways, it's also like A Wrinkle in Time with just the way
Uh-huh.
that the characters are. Because The Wrinkle in Time, that whole series was something that I loved reading as a kid. And that actually
Is there
inspired a lot of my stories.
so is do you have any moral underpinnings? And I'm not, just to, so nobody's confused, I'm not trying to say like, are you trying to teach us a lesson? No, like A Wrinkle in Time had moral underpinnings,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
Um, so do you have any like that, or is it more like I have not read Percy Jackson. I distractedly saw the first movie. Is there more than one movie? But
So I want to say the Percy Jackson, I want to say there's two movies, but the two movies that came out, anyone who has read the Percy Jackson series do not claim those two movies. They do not
yeah,
like those two movies.
yeah.
They're like, this is
So
horrible. We don't talk about that.
yeah. So I'm saying like the themes were contrasting with A Wrinkle in Time is perception I get.
Mhm.
Where A Wrinkle in Time tied everything to a base morality where there was this evil it that wanted to control everything. Sorry if that's a spoiler, but the book's been out for decades.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's been in the movie. There's been, yeah.
And they say that people fighting against fighting against this influence that only wants to control and enslave, wearing the face of order and discipline. People fighting against that included, and it even names Jesus Christ as somebody who fought against that being or influence. So I'm kind of meandering and mumbling, but so that's one thing where very strong, very close tied moral underpinnings of the story. Whereas Percy Jackson, I think it's here's an obvious problem. We should try to fix that problem because this person is doing something that's obviously bad. So let's stop them. A very, very classic manner to set up a story.
So Madeline Langell, a lot of her works are very much based in Christian theology. I can't remember what her religion was. I want to say Catholicism, but I could be wrong. But yes, she's very ardently a Christian, much like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And a lot of their works, there is that base underpinning of good versus evil, and certain things are good and certain things are evil. Whereas you have a lot of more modern authors, like you said, who don't have such a heavy emphasis on a moral underpinning. My stories, if there is a moral underpinning, it was not intentional. It is more of, I like to write what I see as a good story, a story that I enjoy. And I mean, there are certain basic, right versus wrong elements, but I think that those elements are more universal than coded to just like one religion or one religious belief.
But is this going to be like, if they are there, I didn't mean them. Is it going to be like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where, excuse me, the author said he didn't intend to like build any allegory with it. He was just telling a story. But like I'm like, wow, that's a strong allegory of Jesus Christ. Where the spoilers, anyway, the book's been out for decades. Even the movie has been out for almost 2 decades. So, Aslan sacrifices himself, and by the means of his sacrifice, he breaks the evil entity's power, and then he comes back to life too. Like, so for me, that was very strong.
There is
very
a
clear
lot
allegory,
of
even if it was unintended.
There's a lot of allegory. There's a lot of Christian symbolism in C.S. Lewis's work. So, if for him, if he's saying that it wasn't intentional, then it may just be that is like how he how he saw the world. He's not alive anymore.
Yeah.
But it may be that the way he perceived the world was just very strongly through that lens. And so for him, he didn't think that it was him just he thought he was just telling a story.
Yeah. Well, and I think excuse me. I think even if you don't intend to do it, you could very possibly see it coming out and realize that that's what's happening. But that's just how the story is coming together.
Yeah.
And like I wrote my Nightshade Unicorn book that I've been talking about for a few months, and I wrote it. It exists. It's going through editing right now, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Not full swing yet, but it is, and I'm gonna publish it end of February. But the protagonist needed to be called upon to help avert some great disaster, right? And
Yeah.
how do I construct that so that it becomes necessary that this protagonist goes on and does this quest? Well, I decided that she has qualifications in her personality, and
Mhm.
these aren't really spoilers. Nobody's read the book except my 12-year-old daughter yet. Nobody's read it, but um, yeah, like the protagonist had to be somebody with certain qualities, which are moral qualities. And I'm not trying to
Yeah.
teach the reader a lesson and say that, hey, you need to learn to live this way. That's just, this
Yeah.
character is this way, and that's why she's suited for this job. So
Yeah. And
anyway,
I'm
sorry, I
very much
way off on a
I'm very
tangent.
much the same way with my stories. So my characters in some of my stories, they're not going to make the same life choices that I would, but they're the life choices that make sense for that character.
Yeah,
And so like with my Norse fantasy, it's young adult. The characters are, you know, 17, 18, 19 years old. And during the series, the main character gets married to her romantic interest. Um, I am not advocating for 18-year-olds to get married, but I mean, if you got tossed into a world full of dragons and you're having to fight and you know you're dealing with magic and all this kind of stuff, well, I guess maybe if the
yeah.
situation calls for it. Because after she gets married, she becomes queen. So I mean, um, but I'm not advocating for people to get married when they're 18.
I think our culture is a little funny about wanting to marry older,
Hmm.
and I wanted to marry younger than I did. But I wasn't going to force it when it wasn't the right time,
Yeah.
wasn't the right person, whatever. Um, and I got married shortly before I turned 25. So most of the most of Western culture today would say I got married pretty young.
Hmm.
But I had a brother who got married at 22,
Yeah.
and I think our Western culture is kind of funny about thinking that you have to be grown up and well settled. Like it's a journey you go on together, and you build a
And I
life
think it also
together.
depends. I think it also depends on the culture and economics. I outside of writing, I do like to look into like economics and stuff. And if you look actually
Yeah,
historically, um, if you were already well off, if you were upper class or whatnot, you were going to get married younger because you
you
already
afford
had
to.
the assets to take care of a new family. So, um, in some places, getting married young was actually a bit of a status, or having your children get married young was a bit of a status symbol because it's like, look, we already have all of this wealth that,
Yeah,
we're not having to work until a certain age, and then we can have enough money to take care of a family. Whereas in a lot of cultures, if you were not wealthy or upper class, if you didn't have a lot of assets, then yeah, you worked into like your mid 20s until you had enough money to take care of a family or enough land or whatever you needed. Um, and that's why if you look into like a lot of records in the past, the wealthy, the elite, yeah, their kids were getting married off. Marriages were arranged when they were teenagers in their early 20s. Um, and then, but if you were poor, if you were working class, then often you would have individuals they'd be in their mid 20s before they would get married. And that was purely because of an um, because of economic issues.
yeah.
So,
Well, I think we should let people go because it's for both of our listeners tuning in on Christmas Day. Um, it's time to spend with family, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If for our listeners who want to hear our other conversation with author Laura Nelson, I'm going to schedule that for February 8th, which is the next one I see clear on the calendar, because I'm releasing every Thursday. And I did get a little bit ahead of myself in late November and early December and scheduled too many. And I'm going to have an extra 2 episodes this month on Mondays instead of Thursdays. And yeah, so February 8th. And remind us, where can we find you? And where can we find your books on the web?
So my website is www.llnelsonauthor.com. Pretty much all of my social media, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, you name it, all the social media, it's all LL Nelson Author. And then my books are available pretty much on all the different distributors: Amazon, Kobo, Barnes & Noble, you name it. They're also available through libraries.
Okay, great. All right, well, thanks you. Wow. Thanks for joining us today. And I think I'll just close out with wishing everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. We'll catch you next time
Merry
on
Christmas,
the Grand Hill
everyone.
Podcast.